All right, folks, we're just about to start with the first session. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is I'm just going to pass the sheet around. If you have not signed this in the last time, please make sure to put down your information here. You get the latest and greatest from Flutter in Montreal. All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to this month's Flutter Connect. In this edition of Flutter Connect, we're going to be talking about the foundations of user interface in Flutter. We're going to be learning how to build beautiful apps quickly. We're going to start with the most basic building blocks. We're going to start with a basic Hello World app, and we're going to build on that to show you how you can build anything you ever dream of in Flutter. A cool thing about this session is that all the examples that we're going to feature tonight are actually directly from the Flutter documentation. So if you sit through this session, by the end of it, you would have covered all the UI interface, the user interface part of the documentation in Flutter. And by the end of the session, we would have covered the entire section. But another awesome thing is that you can use the project that we're going to be building today as a toolbox that you can pick and choose from to build your next application. So the style of this talk will be, I'm going to show you an app, and then we're going to look behind the scenes to see how that app was built. We're going to reconstruct it, once again, starting with the most basic app, and we're going to build on that. So even if you're a complete beginner, we're going to start from the absolute basics of user interface. The starter code is available at this link, so if you'd like to follow along, feel free to download it if you haven't already downloaded it. But if you don't have a computer or you don't have this code on your machine, that's fine. You can always download it later, and you can catch up whenever you do that. All right, so I'm going to switch over to my Android Studio, which will be our IDE of choice for tonight. So this is the most basic Flutter app that you can have. It's basically a Hello World app, and as you can see, this is the app, and once again, the structure of this entire presentation will be we're going to display an app on the left side, and then we're going to deconstruct it, break it down, and figure out exactly how it was built. This is the most basic app that you can have, and as you can see, it only has Hello World. Before we talk about what's in there, you need to know that in Flutter, the most basic building block is a widget. I'm sure you've heard this before, that in Flutter everything is a widget, and everything that we're going to build tonight is going to be based on widgets, so this is no different. Let's take a look at how this Hello World app is built. In any Flutter app, your entry point is the main.dart file. For this project, we only have the main.dart file. All the other classes that exist in this project, we're just going to copy and paste code from into our main.dart. But basically, our entire app is always going to live in the one class, or I should say the one file, which is main.dart. So let's try to deconstruct this app, the Hello World app. What we have here is the main method, the void main method. And this is the first method, the first entry point for any Flutter application. Now, as you can see, we only have 10 lines of code. It doesn't do much, but we're only writing the code that's necessary to display the UI, which is another awesome thing about Flutter. There is no boilerplate code. How many people here come from an Android background? 0 Android developers? Okay, 1 Android developer, that's me. Okay, how many iOS, okay, thank you. How many iOS developers in the house? No iOS developers, 1 iOS developer. How many web developers? Much better. Sounds good. All right, well, to give you a refresher, how many people here are completely new to Flutter? Great. All right, so let's define Flutter first, and then let's take it from there. So Flutter is a framework that allows you to build applications for Android, iOS, web, and desktop using just one code base. So before Flutter, you would have to write an app for Android, an app for iOS, an app for web. Now that Flutter's here, you just have to write one app. You have all these different platforms. So back to our app that we're building. As we mentioned, the basic building block in Flutter is widgets. And everything that you're going to see here is going to be a widget of some kind. It's either a widget in and of itself, just by itself, or a widget which contains a group of other widgets. In our case, this is our main app, and as we just discussed, our main app is our entry point. We have a method in Flutter called run app, and this is basically the method in the it's part of the main.dart file that you have for your Flutter application, and there's a method called run app. And within this run app, we basically provide it with the widgets that make up our entire application. So our entire application, in this case, our entire Hello World application, is this part right here. The first thing that you notice is this center widget. The center widget, what it does is it centers all the children within the widget into the middle of the screen. So this is why the Hello World string that you see over there is centered exactly in the middle, horizontally and also vertically. The second thing that you will probably notice is the child, which is a text. A text widget, also a widget, is a very simple text widget that allows you to display some text and it will just show up on your screen. The only other parameter that we provided is the text direction. So the text for English is left to right. We specified that here, but it actually defaults to left to right, so you don't need to provide this. So this is it. This is our most basic Hello World app, and as you can see, we're only building the UI from the very beginning. We're not really building any boilerplate code. There's no activity, there's no view controller, there's none of that. It's exactly the code that you would expect to see on your screen, and it's very concise. So that's our first example. Now let's take it one step further. So once again, what I'm doing is, because our entire application lives inside the main.dart, I'm copying over code from all these different examples, which you will find in the project if you download the project. And I'm going to, every time I copy the code over to main.dart, I'm just going to hit the play button and it's going to refresh our simulator. Look how fast it is. I just copied the code over. So if you come from an Android or iOS world, this is a dream come true. The ability to refresh your app instantly just by putting the code, making the changes, pressing the play button, and seeing the results right away. So this is our second example. This is a little bit more sophisticated than the Hello World app, but it's still pretty straightforward. Same as last time, we have a main method, and we have a method called run app right here. But this time, instead of providing it, I'm just going to close this. Instead of providing it with a center widget, which inside of we have the Hello World, let's provide it with something called a material app, which is also a widget, because everything in Flutter is a widget. The material app is kind of like a convenience widget. It allows you to build an application or the basic components of an application, and that would include things like the app bar. This is the app bar right here on top. This is a navigation jar and just like a search icon, but basically this comes as part of the material app. If you remember from the previous example, we didn't have an app bar. We just had a text in the middle of the screen. So we have an app bar, we have a place for our content, and we have a place for the button. And that's what the material app widget does. It gives you the ability to create an app without having to write all that boilerplate. In the next example, we're actually going to rewrite that boilerplate code ourselves, just to show you that you can also do that if you don't really want to write, if you don't want to use the widgets that ship with the app. But if it's there, I suggest you use it. So let's take a look. We have a material app, and we provided two parameters. We provided a title, which says Flutter Home, but this is not the title that you see over there. We're gonna discover where this title comes from. This is the title of the app. So this is basically the name or like the description of your application. And your home page is this home class. Where is this home class? It's right there. It's what's called a stateless widget. A stateless widget is one step over regular widgets, and it provides you with lifecycle methods. This basically means that when you have a stateless widget, you can respond to things like when the phone rotates or when your app shuts down, you have callbacks, which allows you to release resources. If you're not like advanced or even like if you're not a programmer, don't worry about that. Just keep in mind that for now, you have stateless widgets and stateful widgets. A stateless widget generally doesn't change. The app that we have does not change. It's basically just a Hello World app and none of the content changes. So that's why we're using a stateless widget for it. Let's take a look inside this stateless widget and try to deconstruct how we can build this UI. So stateless and stateful widgets have a method called build. Within our build method, this is how we describe our UI to the platform. So everything that you see on the screen will actually be inside of the build method. Now, what are we returning in the build method? As you can see, we are directly just returning a scaffold. I'm just going to minimize it just to show you how simple it is. So our build method returns only this scaffold widget. But what is a scaffold widget? A scaffold widget, much like the scaffold of a real building, gives you a structure for your application. So within the scaffold, we have an app bar. This is, once again, the app bar that we see over there. And here is where we specify the title of the app bar. And it says, as you can see, example title. And that's what's reflected over there. But to break it down fully, the app bar actually has 1, 2, 3 parameters that you can provide out of the box to construct this bar up there. As you can see, the first thing is the leading, which is like the very first element. And our leading element is an icon of this type. So this is like provided from the framework. And that's why we have this menu icon in our app bar. We have a tooltip that says navigation menu. This is basically if you hover over that icon, what is it going to say? This is more so for like assistive applications or assistive accessibility features of your phone. So if you have something like voice dictation in your app, it would say this is the navigation menu. So that's what we're specifying here. And there's also a method called unpressed. This is basically what's going to happen if you click or tap on that item, on the menu item. And as you can see, right now we're not providing it with anything. We're just giving it null. So that means if you press on the menu, nothing happens. So that's the leading thing. That's the very first item. It's just a menu, and it doesn't do anything. But it says navigation menu if you hover over it. The second thing that we have is the text that's in the middle. So now, because it's text, we're just providing the most basic text widget, which is called text. And conveniently enough, we provide it with a title called example title. The third thing in the app bar is the actions. And we provided one action, which is the search action, all the way over there. And if you look at the parameters we provide, we give it an icon called search. So icons is not search. A tooltip similar to this tooltip called search. So if you hover over it, it's going to say search. And just like the leading icon, onPressed has been set to null. So this basically means that if you press on it, for now, nothing will happen. So that takes care of our app bar. Very simple. We constructed the first part, our navigation menu, the second part, the title, and finally, the search. So I'm going to compress this part for now. So that's the first part. That's the app bar. Well, what about the content? What's in here? Well, right now we only have this hello world text. So as you can see, our body, once again, is a center widget, similar to the previous example. But this time, the center widget, actually it's the same as last time. So the center widget also has a text, it's centered in the middle, and it says hello world. Finally, there's another thing that can be provided by your scaffold, which is a floating action button. This is one of many convenience methods, or I should say convenience parameters that's provided to you out of the box from the scaffold that allows you to build a floating action button, which is this guy right over here. It's floating and it does actions. That's why it's called floating action button. And if we try to deconstruct it, same thing. The tooltip says add. The child of the floating action is an icon for add. That's why it looks like this plus sign. And once again, when you press it, nothing happens. For now, we provide it with null. So this is our second example. Generally, whenever you build an app, this would be the quickest way to build like the most common components of your app. So the app bar, that's likely to be common to all your applications. You might or might not use a floating action button, but it's just a cool template that can get you started pretty quickly. But you don't have to use it. As we're going to see in the next example, we're going to reconstruct this view, but we're not going to use the scaffold. So the code is going to be slightly longer, but don't get intimidated because you don't have to do that if you want to reconstruct this. You can just use this. And once again, this is what's called a material app. The next one is a non-material app. So instead of constructing everything using the provided convenience methods, we're going to construct it from scratch. All right, once again, look how fast it loaded. So obviously there's a minor bug in this application because our app bar, or the app bar that we created manually, is all the way on top. So the title is kind of cut off by the iPhone's notch over there. But the idea is basically the same. So if I pushed all the UI a little bit down, it would look exactly the same as the previous example. Let's try to deconstruct the code and see how we can build this scaffold. So similar to last time, we're using a material app. And this time we're providing, instead of providing the scaffold that's provided by the framework, which is called scaffold, we have our own version of it called my scaffold. So let's take a look inside this my scaffold. And it's a stateless widget. Remember, stateless widget basically means that the contents of the widgets don't change. If it was something that maybe whenever we press on it, the value changes, or there's data coming from the backend and whenever it gets updated, our widget would change, then we would use a stateful widget. Don't worry, we're going to take an example of stateful widget in a little bit, but for now, just know that stateless means not going to change, stateful means going to change. So this time, this is the scaffold that we're going to use, and it's our scaffold. It's called my scaffold. It's not the one provided by the framework. Because it's a widget, and it's a stateless widget, of course, it's got a build method. Let's take a look inside this build method. So the first thing that we have is we are returning material, which is also a widget, because everything in Flutter is a widget. There's some comment here. It says, material is a conceptual piece of paper on which the UI appears. Think of it as just like an empty canvas. So within this material widget, what do we have? Well, our child is another widget of type column. So what is a column? A column is basically a widget where all the elements are built on top of each other like a column. So that means that everything in the column is stacked one on top of the other. So what we have here is, first we have my app bar, and then we have the hello world, which is kind of equivalent to the body. So really what's going on here is we have one giant column. It's like stuff stacked on top of each other. The first thing is the app bar, and then right below it is this content right here. So that's what a column is. It's basically widgets, or like the children widget of a column get stacked on top of each other. And that's what we have right here. It's worth mentioning at this point what an expanded widget is. An expanded widget basically means that anything inside of this widget will be stretched to fill the entire space. And that's why our text view, even though the text is just here, it's actually taking up the entire space because we're using an expanded widget. But as you can see, we're basically reconstructing the entire, the first example that we just covered, or I should say the second example that we covered, but we didn't use the provided scaffold. We created our own scaffold. So if you don't want to use the stuff provided to you by the framework, feel free to just reconstruct the whole thing from scratch. That's the way to do it. So let's move on to the third example. So far, our UI doesn't really do anything, right? It just says hello world. Not very fancy. What if we want to start receiving some actions from our users? So in this example, we're actually we have a button in the middle that says engage, and whenever we click on that button, here's what happens. As you can see, it says my button was tapped. So how do we do that? How do we achieve this effect that whenever we tap on this engage button, something seems to be happening in our log? Well, in this example, we're using the most raw way to detect a gesture. So a tap is a gesture, a swipe is a gesture. Any of these inputs to your phone is a different type of gesture. So there is a widget provided by Flutter, which you can use to capture any gesture that you want. But this is the most raw version of that widget. Let's take a look. So once again, we're going to use the scaffold instead of using my scaffold, which we built in the last example, which we didn't have to. That was only for demonstration purposes. But we can totally use the scaffold provided by the Flutter framework, which is what we're going to use right now. So let's take a look inside. Just like the example where we used the scaffold 2 examples ago, we have an app bar and a body. So the app bar is the same, it's the bar on top. Let me expand it. And as you can see, leading, we have a icon that says, that's the menu icon. And the tooltip says navigation menu, and also on pressed is null, which means it doesn't do anything. The title in the middle is example title, and obviously the icon button at the right, so this stuff right here is just the search icon. So that's our app bar, same as last time. What about this stuff in the middle? The button that's in the middle, the one that whenever we click on, it says this button has been tapped. How do we do that? Well, we have another class that we built ourselves called My Button. So this is not shipped with a framework. This is a button that we're building ourselves. Let's take a look inside. My Button is a stateless widget. And once again, it means that the data inside it doesn't change. The display doesn't change. It does one thing only. And it's made of this gesture detector class that we talked about. This gesture detector class is another type of widget, because everything in Flutter is a widget, and it will capture any gesture that you put into it or that you specify. Let's take a deeper look. We're overriding one method of our gesture detector, which is on tap, which means whenever you tap on this My Button that we created, it's going to do this action, which is print My Button was tapped. So this is what happens when you tap on it, but what does it look like? Well, this is what it looks like. There's another widget called container. And the container widget, as you can probably guess, is just a container. You can provide it with things like padding, height, margin. So if you come from the Android world, I'm not really sure about the iOS world, padding and margin are really just ways so you can offset your button. So that's why, for example, the button doesn't stretch all the way to the end of the screen. There's a bit of space here. This is what's called padding. There's also margin, but I don't really want to go into the details of design, like of these design specifics. Just keep in mind that this child is basically just a container of a certain height, certain parameters. The most interesting thing about it is what's inside. What is the child of this container? So it's a center widget, and if you remember, center widgets basically mean aligned to the center. That's why the word engage is exactly in the center. And it's just a text widget that says engage. So there you have it. That's how we built our most basic gesture detector. But you don't have to do that. This is just us reconstructing how a button should behave. But there's a button provided by the Flutter framework that you should use, because it does the whole thing with less code. But instead of just showing you like a button example, I'm gonna give you something a little more practical. Let's now switch over. So far, everything that we've used has been stateless widgets. Let's talk a little bit about stateful widgets. The difference between a stateful and stateless widget is that stateful widgets, the state changes. So that means whenever you do something, you get a different result. Let's paste the code and see what that looks like. So don't be intimidated by all this code. Most of it is actually just comments. But let's try to deconstruct it one more time. So once again, the app on the right is what we're trying to build. As we can see, we have a button and we have a text. The button says increment. The count so far says 0. Let's see what happens when we click on increment. Shocking. The count increases. How did that happen? Well, let's dig in and find out. Just like the other examples, we have a main method and we have inside of it another method that's called run app. So this is where we run our entire application. It says run app. We're providing it once again with a material app. And the material app gives you a title, a home, all that cool stuff that we can use right away. Our home page is the counter home, which is a class that we have created ourselves. So basically our entire app is this class. Let's take a look inside. And this one is stateless, but it contains stateful widgets. So what that basically means is you can have a stateless widget, which most of it doesn't change, and only the parts of it that change, you can use stateful widgets for that. This is kind of a more consolidated way to specify where your state changes. So another way to say this is, everything here does not change, but these two widgets, or this one specifically, does or could change. Let's take a look how we can do that. So once again, our home is this counter home. Let's see what's inside. We also have a scaffold, which gives you an app bar, and it gives you a title. Well, that's part of the app bar. The actions is also part of the app bar. So it gives you a app bar, a body, and floating action button. And that's why we can see an app bar, a body, and a floating action button. The app bar is the same as last time, with some text in the middle that says example title. That's why we see example title over here. The body is another center widget, which means that everything is being centered, but it's actually screwed to the right. So how did that happen? Let's find out. It looks like our child is a counter object. Let's see what counter object looks like. Before we see that, also remember there's a floating action button, which is the button that you see in the bottom right. So this is our entire application, and it seems that the part in the middle is this counter widget. This is the stateful parts. Now, I'm just going to read the comment really quick. This class is the configuration for the state. It holds the values, in this case nothing, provided by the parent and used by the build method of the state. Fields in the widget subclass are always marked final. Well, that's a lot of text to basically say that whenever you have a widget that changes, you should use a stateful widget. In our case, we're providing our state using this counter state class, which we've defined right here. So this state or counter state class basically contains the data or the state of our counter. Let's have a look inside. I'm just going to get rid of some of these comments to make the viewing experience smoother. Great. So as you can see, our counter state, which lives inside our counter, which lives inside of our scaffold, which is being produced on our screen, this is everything in there. Because it's a stateful widget, and both stateful and stateless widgets have a build method, which is right here. So as you can see, whenever we build it, now we have something different. We have a row. Very similar to a column, except horizontal. So what do we have in this row? We have a raise button and we have text. This is the raise button right here, and that's the text. They are horizontally stacked, and that's how a row works. Now, in the previous example, we used the gesture detector to detect a tap that was being input by the user. What we're going to do now is we're going to use a class or a widget provided to us by the framework. This one's called raise button. So this is provided to you. You don't have to rebuild the button yourself. You can just start using this raise button. And it also gives you some methods or some variables or parameters that you can override. Now in this case, onPress does something. In every other case, every widget that had an onPress method, we were returning null, which means it wasn't doing anything. Now we are calling this method _increment. So where is this method? It's right here. What does this method do? Well, it calls another method that's built into the state class, and this is called setState. Whenever setState is called in your state class, what's going to happen is the build method is going to be triggered. So what's going to happen? setState also accepts a variable of how do you want to change your state? Well, we want to plus our counter, which started at 0. That's why this app started with a value of counter 0. And whenever you click on that button, what it's going to do is it's going to trigger this increment method, which is going to set the state, which is going to trigger the build, but it's going to increment the counter first. And that's why whenever I press increment, this happens. What's actually happening is the raise button on press is being triggered, which means increment is being called. Increment is called, so setState is called. setState takes this parameter, which is what are we going to change? We're going to increase the counter by 1, and because setState is called, build is going to be called again. And then the second time it's called, it's going to reconstruct this. Another thing that we forgot to mention is that we have a text here. And what we have is this $sign and then the counter that we have. So this basically means we're going to display count, like the word count, followed immediately by the value of our counter, which is right now the number 7. So to recap, what we're doing is whenever we press the button, we hit the increment method. This calls set state. It increases the counter by 1, and it also calls the build method, which basically returns everything that we've built, but now based on this new value for counter, which right now is 7. It's actually considered good practice in real life if you separate your widgets into different classes. So this is the next example from the documentation. It's going to look exactly the same. Let me show you. So it looks exactly the same. As you can see, the counter was reset to 0. The only difference between this example and the previous example, let me show you, is in the... So now, instead of having a text and a raise button, we actually have a counter display and a counter incrementer. Let me show you where that is. Everything else is exactly the same. So we have our same stateless widget. We have a scaffold. We have our app bar, which draws this bar up here. We have our center, which is the body. This is stuff in the middle. And inside of it, we have a counter, which is our counter class. And our counter class, once again, is a stateful widget that returns a state object of type state in the create state method. It's this guy right here. And it's got a row, which means stuff is stacked horizontally, exactly the same as the previous example so far. But instead of having a button and a text, we have these new widgets, counter incrementer and counter display. We built these widgets. They're exactly the same. We just extracted them into 2 different classes to demonstrate the proper way to separate your widgets so that whenever you want to make changes to one individual widget, then you have a specific class for that. And if we look inside here, we have a counter incrementer that takes a parameter. So let's take a look here. It's just a raise button. So we've extracted the button and the text, and we put them in 2 different classes. So the text is the display. So this right here is going to be a text. So this is exactly the same as the previous example, but instead of using a raise button and a text directly, we've just extracted them into a counter display and a counter incrementer. Just best practice. No new functionality is actually added in this example. All right, so now let's build something actually practical, or I should say like more real life like. Look how fast the app builds. This is the beauty of Flutter. You paste your code, you hit play, and it just rebuilds the whole thing. All right, let's take a look at this app, and it's called Shopping List. Let's see what it does. So it looks like we have a list of eggs, flour, chocolate chips. Whenever we click on any of these items, it gets checked off. Whenever we click on it again, it gets unchecked off. So how can we achieve this? The entry point for any application, as we discussed, is the main method. And our main method here, just like every other example, returns a material app with a title and a home. This time, our home is this class called Shopping List that we've created, and it looks like it receives a parameter called products, and we've specified like an array of products. That's why we have a square. An array is like a collection, like more than one item. So we have 3 items provided, and these items are product classes, which are also classes that we've created. So we have a shopping list that we've created, and we have a product class that we've created. Let's take a look at the shopping list first. All right, so our shopping list is another stateful widget, which means we have to return a state of some kind. In our case, we're returning the shopping list state. So let's take a look inside of that. This will contain the state of whatever is present in the middle, which means it will have a build method that will construct all that. So this is actually the UI that we have in our app. It's a scaffold, just like the scaffold that we've been covering in every other example, which means it's got an app bar, the bar on top. In the middle, we have a list view. So this is a new type of widget that we're about to cover. It's basically a list of different items. And we provide it with certain parameters. The first one is padding. So padding is the distance, the inside distance, which is this distance here. It's here also, but it's invisible. So we provide a padding of 8 pixels, and the children are basically a variable called products, which is mapped to a shopping list item. So if you remember, we whenever we constructed our shopping list, we provided it with these 3 items. What we want to do is we want to convert a product into a shopping list item. And the way to do that is by using map. So map will take one value and then map it to another value. In our case, we're receiving a product value, and we want to map it to a shopping list item, which is also a widget that we've created. Let's take a look inside. The shopping list item is basically every item that you see on that list. So eggs, flour, and chocolate chips. So now we're deconstructing each of these items to see how it was built. Just like every other stateless or stateful widgets, obviously it's got a build method. Inside this build method, this time we have something new called a list tile. A list tile is a widget provided by the framework which gives you the kind of the generic or standard way to display list items. So it gives you like 3 lines, it gives you an icon on the left. It's kind of like a convenience widget that allows you to build list items. In our case, we're going to override 3 parameters. We're going to write on tap, so this will dictate what will happen if we click on any of the list items. We're going to override leading, which basically is the icon in the beginning, the E, the F, and the C, that's where they come from. We're also going to override title. And the title is basically this value here, so eggs, flour, and chocolate chips. So we're building a list tile, and this list tile is basically built from each product that we're providing to each list tile. So the list tile, the first thing is on tap. Whenever on tap is triggered, the on cart changed callback. I don't really want to get into like the definition of the callback. It's basically a parameter that we provided to our shopping list, which tells it what happens whenever we click on it. And we can see, let me trace it. So we can see here that it was provided as part of the constructor. So this is it right here. So this method, handle cart change, is actually what happens whenever we click on any of these items. Let's take a look. Once again, we're calling the set state method, which means it's going to rebuild our UI. And that's why whenever we click on any of these items, our interface changes, because we're rebuilding it based on new state. But how are we going to modify this state? Well, just going to delete this code. This is actually how we modify the state. If this item is already in carts, which is a parameter that basically means that it's been checked off, then, So first, we have this exclamation mark, which means if not in cart, then add it to cart. Whenever you add it to cart, it gets striked out. And if it's not in cart, or if it is in cart, then whenever we hit it, it's going to be removed. So this is why whenever we have an item that's already in cart, like eggs, it gets removed. But how does it actually build it in a way that it gets scratched out? Well, let's see what the build method does. So remember, this is for each shopping list item. We were just discussing what happens when you click on it. But now let's take a look at how it's being displayed. So we have a text widget which displays eggs, flour, or chocolate chips. But is it striked out or not? Let's get the style from this method. And basically, if the item is not in cart, we return nothing. But if it is in cart, we do a line through. So if this item is already in our carts, then we don't need to do anything. It's already scratched out. But if it's not, we convert the style to be a line through. And that's why eggs has a line through whenever we click on it. Same thing for any of these 3 items. And yeah, so this is a slightly more sophisticated example, a more real-life example of how you can build a real-life shopping cart. And as you can see, the entire application lives in this main.dart class. All right. So this is all the examples that are in the documentation for the introduction section. So now you've basically covered, it's the exact equivalent as if you went to flutter.dev, you went to the UI section, and you went through all the examples. So now you've completely covered the intro section. Let's go to the next section. It's called the layouts section. The first thing they have in the layouts section is this app called Pavlova. So I'm going to paste this into Dart. But this app is actually designed for tablets rather than phones. So I have another simulator here, an iPad Pro, and I'm going to run it on the simulator instead of running it on the, on the iPad simulator instead of running it on the iPhone simulator, because it's designed for a tablet in this mode. Just to change things up a little bit and to show you that Flutter can run on phones, tablets, anything. Bam. Well, first of all, it's probably worth mentioning these lines, these are like construction lines. This means there's a bug of some kind in our UI. This means that the UI is bigger than our tablet. So whenever you see this, you know that your UI is actually built like bigger than your design. You might want to revisit it and make it smaller so it doesn't go off screen. But this will not be shown on a real tablet. This is only for like developers to know, hey, by the way, you built something that's bigger than your screen, you might want to address that. So this is our app, Pavlova. As you can see, it's a picture and a bunch of text. Before even digging into the code, I can start guessing how this was built. Because at the very top level, we have two big sections. We have a picture and we have some text. So I know these are two items that are right next to each other. Must be a row. Must be a horizontal stacking, which means it's a row. Cool. So that means it's a row of picture and also this. What is this? Well, this is text stacked on top of each other, but instead of being stacked horizontally like this row, it's stacked vertically. So I can take a very educated guess and say this is a column. So this is a row which has one column and one image. Within this column, we have text, text, images, 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 text, text. And that's how you can deconstruct or imagine any UI and rebuild it using Flutter. So even before looking at the code, just by looking at the user interface, I can start to guess how this is built. Now let's take a look at the code. All right, so once again, we have our main method. This debug paint size enabled, don't worry about that. It's part of the example, and what this does is, I believe it shows you some layout things that are suitable for debugging. It actually is set to false by default. But the only reason it's being mentioned in this example from the tutorial, and that's why it was copied over here, is it's telling you, you can set this to true, and then you get, it's gonna break down your UI. But we're not gonna do this for this section. I'm just telling you that this, you can kind of ignore for this tutorial. The same method that we always have, run app, and it runs my app. So this is our my app. Let's see what's inside. So my app is a stateless widget, which means it definitely has a build method. What's inside the build method? As always, a material app. This is the title of our material app. This is our homepage. Our homepage is actually created using a method called build homepage, which takes one parameter, which is the title. In this case, our title is Strawberry Pavlova Recipe. So we're going to call build homepage method. We're going to pass it this constructor. Let's see what it does. Or this parameter. Let's see what it does. There's all these variables that we're going to be using. We have a title, a subtitle, some stars, some ratings, a description for a text style, and an icon list. These are basically all the visual elements that we have here. So all the text, all the icons, the ratings, for example, is here. We're basically creating all the elements that we're going to put together to create this UI. So we're defining all the elements that we want to use first, and then we're going to put them together. So we've already defined them. We have our title, our subtitle. Just as an example, let's look at the title. So the title says Strawberry Pavlova. And as you can see here, the title is basically a container. And as we talked about earlier, a container is just a widget that you can provide some parameters to. In this case, we're providing a padding, which is spacing on the outside. And we are providing it, the style that we're providing it is certain weight for the font, spacing for the letters, and font size. So that's how we get this display here, Strawberry Pavlova. So these are all the elements. Let's take a look at how they're being built inside the scaffold. Inside of our scaffold, just as always, we have our app bar, which is what we see on top here. I'm just going to minimize the iPhone. So our app bar has a title, which is passed in to our widget, and in our case, it's Strawberry Pavlova recipe. We have in our body a center widget, which means everything inside of it is going to be centered in the middle. So all the rows and columns, when they come together, they're going to be in the middle of the screen. And that's why our recipe and our picture are situated in the middle of the entire screen. Here's a new widget, card. Now card basically creates this extruded effect. It's not very clear maybe on a projector, but it's like a 3D card that includes all your text. Just like a nicer way of seeing things. Cards are pretty common in a lot of applications, and are provided to you out of the box in Flutter. Within this card, as we discussed, whenever we were guessing what's going on here, there's a row, which means there's one or more items that are stacked horizontally, which is what we have. We have a picture, we have this column. So let's take a look. As you can see, the row, the first element is a container, which has our column that we discussed. The column is basically the title, the subtitle, the ratings, and the icons. All the stuff that we built earlier. So the title, the subtitle, the ratings, and the icons. I'm not really going to go into details of those, just to save time so we can cover more examples. And then, since the first item is that container, which has that column, and that's why this column here on the left is basically, that's what we just defined. And obviously the next item would be the image, which is the image of a Strawberry Pavlova. Let's see how that's constructed. This is yet another widget. It's called image. And the image widget is basically an image. Shocking. But how do you specify it? Well, you can provide it with a parameter called asset, and then you can basically specify the path of your image. So this is actually an image that I've included in the project called pavlova.jpg. And this is an image that I added into the project. Something worth mentioning at this point is any images that you add, you have to define them in your pubspec.yaml file. This is like the directory or the manifest of your file. And over here, I just specified, hey, by the way, everything inside the images directory included in my project. And that's how I was able to access the picture of a Strawberry Pavlova. And so that's that example. So we've already covered what a container is. I'm not going to go over it one more time. I'm just going to quickly go over grid and list. This is another cool application. I'm going to run this instead of on the iPad. I'm going to run it on the iPhone. I'm actually going to close the iPad because we don't need it anymore. And now, as you can see, this is an example of a list. We have a list of items. So how do we build it? We already covered list view a little bit earlier. This example goes a little bit deeper into the list view. I'm guessing there's going to be a list tile here somewhere. Nope, my guess was wrong. Ah, yes, there is. So the children of the list are basically these tiles. And these tiles are of type list tile. And as we talked about, a list tile is basically an entry in your list which has up to 3 lines and a leading image. It's kind of like a standard way that you can build a list without having to reconstruct the whole thing from scratch. In this example, we can actually set this parameter, so they provide you with show grids and they set it to false. And I give you a little comment that says, set this to false to show list view. So this is false, and that's why we see a list view. Let's see what happens if we switch it to true. Bam, switch to grid view. The reason this happened is because we have two methods. We have a method called build list and build grids. And if we go inside our build method of our main app, the same as every other time, we see this line here which says, let's create a center widget which is going to center whatever content into the middle, but we want to check first, is show grid set to true or false? Now it's true, which means build grid method will be called. That's why we have a grid. Now if this was set to false, instead it would build list. And this is how this app is constructed. If we change it from build grid to build list, let's do it one more time. Bam, we have a list. So that's the grid and list example. So I'm going to skim through this super quickly. This is our card and stack. We've already covered the cards, so you know what that is. It's just like a 3D display of a card. I can't get over how fast it is. It's unbelievable. If you've ever done any native development, this is literally a dream come true. Anyway, so now we have our card and stack example, and I posted it in. And this time around, we have a card. They probably provide you a way for switching it from a card to a stack. Probably the same thing. There we go. So we have this parameter called show card. Let's set it to false. Let's see what happens when we do that. And it switches it to a stack. We haven't covered stack yet. A stack is basically widgets stacked on top of each other. In our case, we have an image of Maya, I guess, and we have a text which says Maya also on top of it. We're going to go over it really quickly, but I'm not going to go over cards just to save time. You've already seen that before. So build card will be called if it was true, but because it's false, we're going to call build stack instead. And as you can see, the children that we have a circle avatar, which is another widget provided to you by the framework. It basically provides you with an avatar image in a circle shape, and you can just provide it with an image. And the same as before, we're providing it an asset. This time it's called pic0, which apparently is the picture of Maya. And we provide it with a radius. This will provide you with the size of your circle. Now we set it to 100. The next thing is, on top of it, we're laying a text. Well, a container that inside of it has a text, which says Maya B. And here's just some stuff for the text, the size, the font, weights, and some colors. And that's how we achieve this effect of a stack. An image on top of it, there's a text. So we covered a card, and now we covered a stack. This is the last example in the layout section. And it's called Building Layouts Tutorial. So this is basically everything that we've ever discussed so far built into one screen, like one practical screen. Before we dig into the code, I'm pretty sure if you've been paying attention so far, you can guess how this layout was built. Looks like it's a column because there's stuff on top of each other, of an image, and then a text, or perhaps a column within a row, because this is horizontal to this. So this is a row, inside of it is a column and an image. This could also be another row because we have an image and a text. And beneath this outer row is another row, which got icon, 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 text, 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 and beneath that is more text. So as you can see, without even looking at the code, I can start to reconstruct the app in my head and I can guess how it's built. If you get in the habit of this, you can create anything that you want just by thinking about it a little bit before you get to the code. So we're going to cover this super quickly and then we're going to have a break. So once again, we have our main method and it runs our run app, which is the method where we provide our app. It's called My App, which is right here. It's also another stateless widget, which means nothing changes on this screen because it is stateless. Let's take a look inside the build method, which every stateful and stateless widget has. As we guessed, the first thing that we have, so we have all these, first we're declaring all the things we're going to use. We have a title section. We have a color that we're going to be using. We have a button section. It's probably the call, route, share buttons. We have a text section, and they're all stacked on top of each other. But first we're defining them so we can start using them in our UI. Let's take a look at what's inside our return, which is a material app, which probably means within it there's a scaffold, which will have our app bar that says Flutter Layout Demo, and then a body which has all this stuff that we've been constructing. Surprise, it is exactly that scaffold. This is our app bar. The app bar has a title. It says Flutter Layout Demo, which is what's set on top there. And the body, actual surprise, is a list view. So I thought this was going to be a column, but it's actually a list view. But columns and list views are quite similar in the fact that they are stacked on top of each other. Our list view has all these children. So we have an image, that's the lake that you see on top. We have the title section, which we just defined, but I'm guessing it's basically a row of column and possibly another row. I just want to check to see if my guess was right. So it's a row, and within that row, we have a column, an icon, and a text. Close. I was pretty close. So that's our title and subtitle. And beneath that is the button section. Let's take a look. And the button section is this stuff here in the middle. It says call, route, and share. And as you can see, for each one of these, we're calling a method called build button column. Let's see what it does. Well, very simply, it's a column, which means it's items stacked on top of each other. And this column has an icon and a container of text. And this will explain why we have an icon and a container of text. Icon, container of text. And the next thing on the list is our text section, which should be pretty straightforward. I'm guessing it's a container with padding and some text inside. Let's take a look. There's not even a container. It's just text. And the text is all this stuff. Lake, whatever lies, wherever, does whatever. And that's the last example in the layout section. I was planning on going into the navigation section. So far, you've learned everything that you need to build any UI in Flutter. It might take a little bit of getting used to, the thought process of how you can deconstruct your ideas into rows, columns, images, text, and whatnot. But right now, you have all the tools that you need to literally build anything that you want, as long as it's based on these components. If you want to build something a little bit out there, something completely different, you absolutely can. In my experience, in most cases, you use things like button, text, images. So we covered all these things. So as you can see, it's not that much work, it's not that much code, and now you can go ahead and build any UI that you want. The next section is navigation. I've also omitted animation. So navigation and animation are going to be covered in the next session. Navigation allows you to go from one screen to another. So far, we've been building single screens. But what if you want to go from one screen to another? And what if you want to animate from one screen to another? That'll be the talk for next time. And the second talk, we're going to continue building Flutter Connect. So stick around for that. You will need a laptop if you want to follow along. And the next one is going to be navigation and animation. So stay tuned for that. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
What does the boolean, at the top of all examples, it was default to false, and you say that if you trigger it to true, it shows.
Let's find out. I never actually set it to true. Let's find out. I guess you're talking about this guy right here. Let's go for the previous example, because here it's giving us a bug. The what?
That was okay. This one was fine. So the other one you couldn't do it because you didn't import your Android thing.
Smart. You're right. Didn't think about it too much. I just saw the line and I was like, let's use another one. There you go. So it basically shows you, it deconstructs it. So even if you're like, I have no idea how this was built, well, you can break it down and you can start using it that way. But obviously this will not show up in your production app. This will show up only whenever you're running this code. You had a question.
You spoke about GCU that
Yes.
but GCU is built for unknown 8 of content.
Yes.
Do you have any advice about it? Because I found dogs and they do not recommend to use GCU.
Really?
In Vision, yeah. Because it's a big performance issue.
I hear you. Well, definitely a list view is more sophisticated than just a column. But list view also comes with an advantage, which is if you have elements that are bigger than your screen. Let's say you have 1,000 items. So obviously 1,000 items will not fit on your screen. What it does is it only loads to the memory the stuff that's on your screen. So if you scroll down, it's going to start throwing away all the stuff that's not on screen and rebuilding the other stuff. So if you have a small list of items, you don't need that much sophistication or that much code because you're just displaying one static set of items. But if you do have a big list, you will have to include that in your app. So I would guess the reason they mention that is it's obviously a performance hit because you're doing all this processing in order to show the things that are off screen, the things that are on screen. So if your use case is very simple and you don't need to do that, then stick with with column. But if you have a list, especially if it's a dynamic list, I would definitely recommend just going for a list view, which will give you smooth scrolling and all the fancy things that come with list view. Yes.
You use the list view to have a list of items and that you can scroll if you have a lot of items.
Yes.
My question is, how can you, which widget can you use if you want to implement a horizontal scrolling view? That you can scroll
Yes.
out from vertical.
Great question. So you can use actually a vertical list view or a horizontal list view. I haven't looked directly into the docs of how list view works. I'm pretty sure there's a parameter that you can specify that says whether it's horizontal or vertical. Just because we're running out of time, I won't check now, but I'll check on the break and I'll verify it. It's probably one parameter that you just have to set from vertical to horizontal. Yes. Scroll direction. There it is. Yes.
I have a question about Flutter. So, is it still relevant to use like Android Studio or iOS-based IDE or techniques, or I don't know?
Great question. This is the third time I get that question. So, all right. So right now we use Android Studio. I come from an Android background. Android Studio just is intuitive for me. As you can see, it's got everything that you need out of the box. It's pretty straightforward and easy to use. But there's other IDEs. Some people like to use Xcode. Xcode is like a stripped down version, like IDE that doesn't have any Android specific stuff. It's basically, you can add in any plugins that you want, including the ones for Flutter. So I would recommend if you come from an Android background, Android Studio, you're going to feel right at home. But if you don't, or even if you just want to try something different, Xcode will give you a more light experience. But don't underestimate Xcode. It has everything that Android Studio offers. It's just not built for Android. It's rather just built for more a generic development platform. And that's what people who come from non-Android background tend to go for. Take one more question, and that's it. VS Code, yes. Sorry, not Xcode. Not Xcode. Xcode is for iOS. VS Code is the way to go. Okay, last question. So I haven't looked into that yet. My understanding is that this is already a web app. This is like a mobile first, but also mobile and web. So right now I'm running it on an iOS device. I know for a fact that I can also run it on an Android device. If I just, like for example, I'm gonna load another Android device and I'm just going to run the same thing, the exact same app. It's actually a great question because it demonstrates how quickly it is that so we've been building for iOS so far. So that's the iOS simulator on the right. What's happening now is I'm building the Android version. So it's launching main.dart, which is our entire application always. This time it's launching it on Android. It's just going to take a second to build the Android app, but all the processing time that's going into building the app only needs to be done once. So if I change the code, it's going to be just as fast as iOS. And bam, bam, there it is. Looks exactly the same. Android, iOS, one code base. So we'll stop questions for now. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them at the end of the next session. Please help yourself to some food. Thanks.